Welcome to the examination of one of the most intriguing chess strategies ever employed on the board. In this video we analyze a game by Alexander Alekhine, which demonstrates a remarkable paradox that went against conventional principles of chess. Traditionally, players aim to develop their pieces as soon as possible and prevent the opponent's development. Alekhine, however, turned this principle on its head. Instead of bringing his undeveloped pieces into play, he deliberately moved his already developed pieces, seemingly wasting valuable tempi. Even more striking, with these sophisticated maneuvers, Alekhine forced his opponent to develop pieces. And this strategy, paradoxically, set the stage for a devastating attack and spectacular sacrifices. Let's dive into this strategic and tactical masterpiece and uncover the brilliance behind Alekhine's paradoxical approach. His opponent started with d4, Alekhine played d5, and after c4 Alekhine opts for the Slav defense, c6. After knight f3, knight f6 and e3, in case black first develops the light-squared bishop and only then plays e6, we would still have the Slav defense. Alekhine, however, plays e6 right away, without developing the bishop, after which the game transposes into the semi-Slav. It's a combination of the Slav defense, because black has played c6, and the queen's gambit declined, as black has played e6 without developing the bishop. Now black's position is solid, but a little bit passive. White develops the queen's knight, knight c3, Alekhine develops his queen's knight, knight d7, queen c2, bishop d6, bishop d3, both sides castle, after which Alekhine develops his queen, queen e7, and white increases the tension in the center by playing e4, also opening the dark squared bishop's diagonal. Alekhine captures on c4, and after bishop takes c4, as you see, white is dominating the center. He has two very strong pawns in the center, so Alekhine challenges white's domination in the center by playing e5, also opening his light-squared bishop's diagonal and also creating an immediate threat of winning a pawn by capturing on d4, and after knight takes d4, it turns out that the white knight would be unguarded on d4 and black can sacrifice his bishop on h2, and after king takes h2, queen e5, checking the white king, and after the king retreats, the queen from e5 would capture the unguarded d4 knight and black would win a pawn. For this reason, white plays rook d1, defending the d4 square. Alekhine still captures on d4, and after knight takes d4, knight b6, attacking the bishop retreats to f1, and now Alekhine starts to execute sophisticated maneuvers. So, white's e4 pawn is weak. It's attacked twice and defended twice. But in case black plays rook e8, attacking the pawn for the third time, in case he plays rook e8 right away, he wouldn't achieve much, because white would simply play f3, reinforcing the pawn. So, first, instead of rook e8, Alekhine plays rook d8, creating again a threat of winning a pawn by bishop takes h2 check, king takes h2, rook takes d4, and after rook takes d4, this time the white rook on d4 would be unguarded and the black queen would move to e5, checking the white king on h2, and after the king retreats, the queen would capture the rook and again black would win a pawn. For this reason, in order to save the h2 pawn, white plays h3. And now we can see the idea behind rook d8. By playing rook d8, Alekhine induced his opponent to play h3 and weaken his kingside. So this weakening will tell later in the game, as you will see. So in case the black rook returns now to e8, again threatening to capture on e4, it turns out that white can simply ignore this threat by playing a4, threatening to push the pawn forward, kicking the knight out of b6, and the only square for the knight would be d7, and on d7 the knight would close the bishop's diagonal, after which the bishop would stop controlling the f5 square and the white knight would invade with a tempo, and in case black captures on e4, it turns out that white of course can play rook e1, pinning the knight, which can be quite unpleasant. White is threatening in this case to capture the knight, and the only way to defend it would be f5, which would weaken black's kingside, and after that white can play bishop d3 with very unpleasant pressure on the diagonal and on the open e-file. For this reason, after h3, instead of rook e8, Alekhine, instead of developing his undeveloped queenside, he moves the already developed piece, the bishop, bishop c7, creating again an immediate threat. By playing bishop c7, he has opened the rook's file and he is threatening to capture the knight, and after rook takes d4, again the rook on d4 would be unguarded, and by playing queen e5, black would threaten both checkmate on h2 and to capture the rook, so black would win the material in this case. For this reason, after bishop c7, white plays bishop e3. So it looks paradoxical and even absurd. Alekhine has moved his already developed bishop from d6 to c7, forcing his opponent to develop a piece, which completely goes against the traditional positional principles. The opposite should be the case. One should develop his own pieces and prevent the opponent's development. But Alekhine does the opposite, but he has his point. By forcing the bishop, the white bishop, to move to e3, now we can see what Alekhine achieved. The bishop is standing in front of the rook, so in case the white rook moves to e1, it wouldn't defend the e4 pawn anymore. So now Alekhine again moves his already developed rook to e8 instead of developing his queenside. And this time he is threatening to capture on e4, because after knight takes e4, white wouldn't have rook e1 anymore. And by playing rook e8, he actually again forces white to develop his piece. So the rook was already developed. Alekhine again moved his already developed piece and again forces his opponent to develop the second bishop. In case white plays f3 instead of bishop d3, of course, this would weaken his kingside. The bishop on e3 wouldn't be defended anymore. The f2 pawn was defending it, but now the bishop isn't defended, and black can play knight d5, attacking the bishop. In case white captures the knight, of course, the black queen would capture the bishop with a check. So the bishop must retreat in this case, and the black knight would invade f4. Black pieces would be active, and black can initiate a very strong attack. Next move by playing queen e5, creating a bishop and queen battery, threatening immediate checkmate by knight takes h3 check and queen h2 checkmate. So that would be unpleasant. So instead of f3 in this position, after rook e8, white plays bishop d3, which makes it even more paradoxical. By moving his already developed bishop to c7, then by moving his rook, already developed rook, from d8 to e8, Alekhine first forced his opponent to develop the dark squared bishop and then to develop his light squared bishop. But the idea is that these bishops on d3 and e3 are standing on the way of the white rooks. The best squares for the white rooks would be e1 and d1 in order to fight for the center. But now that the bishops are on e3 and d3, they are closing the rooks' files, and the rooks on d1 and e1 wouldn't be effective. Besides that, both of these bishops will turn into a target of attack, as you will see. So again, instead of developing his queenside, Alekhine moves the already developed knight to h5 with the idea of knight f4, after which he is going to exchange his knight for the light squared bishop, after which he would get the advantage of two bishops, and this advantage would tell, because two bishops are very strong in the open position with the pawns on the both sides of the board. In order to prevent the invasion of the black knight to f4, white plays knight e2, taking under control the f4 square. Now Alekhine wants to bring his b6 knight closer to the center and to the white's kingside. For this reason, he wants to play knight d7 followed by knight e5, from which the knight would again attack the bishop. But in case he plays knight d7 right away, the knight would close the light-squared bishop's diagonal and the white knight would invade f5 with a tempo, attacking the queen. For this reason, before moving his knight to d7, Alekhine plays g6, taking under control the f5 square. White plays rook e1, indirectly reinforcing the e4 pawn. So now we can see that the white pieces are crowded and they stand in one another's way. So these pieces don't coordinate. That was Alekhine's idea. They are actually, although it might look that white has better development, indeed, all minor pieces, white pieces, are developed, while black still hasn't developed his queen side, but actually this development isn't effective at all. So now that Alekhine took under control the f5 square, he can play knight d7, intending to move to e5. In case white prevents it by playing f4, now that the knight cannot jump to e5, it would jump to f6, attacking the e4 pawn for the third time, and it's defended only twice. And as you see, the rook's file is barricaded by the knight, the bishop, so the rook isn't actually defending the pawn. So black is threatening to capture the pawn. The only way to save the pawn would be e5, but after that, the pawn, the e4 pawn, which used to be on e4, wouldn't control the d5 square anymore, and the black knight would invade d5, attacking the bishop. The bishop cannot retreat to f2 because the f4 pawn would fall, so it must move to d2, but that would weaken this diagonal and the black bishop would move to b6, creating a very unpleasant pin and pressure on this diagonal. The most natural move for white would be king h1, moving away from this pin, but in this case white is losing the pawn because the only defender of this knight is the e2 knight, so black can simply capture on f4, and after knight takes f4, the d4 knight would fall. Black is winning a pawn in this case. For this reason, after knight d7, in the anticipation of knight e5, as f4 doesn't work, white plays knight f3, taking under control the e5 square. Now Alekhine plays bishop b6, so the e3 bishop turns into a target of attack. Black is simply threatening to capture on e3, and after f takes e, of course, white's pawn structure on the king side would be demolished. In case white exchanges the bishops himself, Alekhine, of course, would capture with a pawn, and his rook, his undeveloped rook, without making a single move, would turn into a very active piece, and the b6 pawn would also control the important squares. For this reason, as black is threatening to capture on e3, white plays bishop g5, attacking the queen. And Alekhine plays queen c5, threatening to capture on f2, creating a very strong queen and bishop battery, and also offering the exchange of the queens. But in case white exchanges the queens, that would be in black's favor, because black's pieces would become very active. After knight takes c5, black would threaten to capture the bishop, also to capture the pawn, which would be attacked twice. The only way to save material would be knight c1, defending the bishop, and also opening the rook's way to defend the pawn. But in this case, after f6, bishop d2, black can capture on d3, getting the advantage of two bishops, which is already a big advantage. And after that, Alekhine gives a very strong move in his annotations, knight g3. Unexpected move. The knight, of course, cannot be taken because the pawn is pinned, and from g3, the knight attacks the e4 pawn. And the only way to save the pawn would be e5, but after the pawn leaves the e4 square, it stops controlling the f5 square, so the black bishop would invade f5, and all black pieces would become very strong, very active. The knight is under attack. After the knight retreats, the black knight can jump to e4, attacking the d2 bishop, also closing the e1 rook's file, after which the e5 pawn would be under attack, so black would be better in this case. For this reason, after queen c5, white avoided the exchange of the queens, and as the f2 pawn is under attack, he plays knight c3, opening the queen's line and defending the f2 pawn. And now Alekhine plays knight e5, threatening not only to exchange his knight for the bishop, but also even more serious threat. Knight takes f3 is threatened, destroying white's kingside pawn structure. For this reason, to prevent knight takes f3 check, white exchanges himself. But now this battery moves to another diagonal. First, the queen takes e5 with a tempo attacking the bishop, and after the bishop moves to e3, the bishop to c7. Now a very strong, very dangerous battery is created, and black is threatening to invade h2 with a check, and after king f1, queen h1 check, king e2, the queen would capture on g2, winning the first pawn, after which the h3 pawn would also fall and white's position would collapse. g3 doesn't help, which closes this diagonal, but after g3 the h3 pawn would fall. For this reason, after bishop c7, in the anticipation of queen h2 check, white brings his knight closer to the king side. Knight e2. Alekhine plays queen h2 check, of course, and after king f1 we have reached the critical position. Now you can pause the video and try to find Alekhine's combination. How to continue the attack. Of course, the obvious move would have been queen h1 check. The only move would be knight g1. That was the idea behind knight e2, to bring the knight to g1, but in this case black can play bishop h2, threatening to capture the knight, but the white king can escape after king e2. Of course, black can capture the pawn. The white king escapes. Black is much better, of course, he's up a pawn, but the white king escapes. But Alekhine wasn't interested in pawns. He was interested in the king. And the bishop, his undeveloped bishop, makes its first move. And what a move! Immediately sacrificing itself in order to destroy white's kingside and deprive white king from its defense. So bishop takes h3. Black is threatening to capture on g2, so white is forced to accept the sacrifice. G takes h, queen takes h3 check. King g1, bishop h2 check. Everything is forced. King must move to h1, and now the knight joins the attack. Knight f4, threatening checkmate in 1. So white must capture this knight. In case he captures with a bishop, the bishop would leave the e3 square, would stop defending the f2 pawn, and the white king would get checkmated in 3 moves. After bishop g3 check, the standard checkmate would follow. Queen h2 check, followed by queen takes f2 checkmate. So white must capture the knight with the knight in order to keep the f2 pawn defended. So white captures with the knight. Now, of course, bishop g3 check doesn't work. White would simply capture the queen. So Alekhine, of course, captures the knight with the discovered check. King g1, now the bishop returns to h2 with a check, and after king h1, Alekhine makes another strong, spectacular move. He already sacrificed one bishop, and now he sacrifices the second bishop. Queen f3 check. White must capture the bishop, and now we can see the idea behind this second sacrifice. Rook e5, threatening to checkmate the white king in 2 moves. Rook h5 check and rook h1 checkmate. The only way to prevent this is queen c5. And of course, Alekhine now captures the queen. After bishop takes c5, the obvious move is, of course, to capture the light squared bishop. However, Alekhine captures the dark squared bishop, because it's a stronger piece. the light squared bishop is restricted by its own pawn, and black's dark squares on his king side are weakened. So this bishop can create some problems for the black king. So instead of capturing on d3, Alekhine plays queen h5 check with the double attack. And after the white king moves to g2, he captures on c5. Now he has the material advantage and his attack continues. White brings the rook into the defense of the third rank as his king is exposed. Alekhine develops his rook, rook e8, rook e1. Now e5 might give white at least some counter chances, but Alekhine prevents it by playing queen e5, blockading the e pawn and also attacking the b2 pawn. So white plays rook e2, defending the pawn. Rook e6, the rook comes closer and closer to the white king. White plays b3, rook f6, rook g3, king g7. Alekhine isn't in a hurry. Bishop b1, white doesn't have any counter chances. Rook f4, bishop d3, rook h4, intending queen a1, threatening checkmate in 1 after that. White plays king f3, queen f4 check, forcing the white king to return to g2, and queen c1, again threatening checkmate in 1. That's why king f3, and besides a very strong attack, black also has a passed pawn on the h-file, so Alekhine pushes it forward. h5. Rook c2 attacking the queen, queen d1 check, king e3, rook h1, moving away from the pawn's way. King d4, h4 attacking the rook, rook e3, rook e1, exchanging the rook, which controls the h3 square. Rook takes e1, queen takes e1, rook e2 attacking the queen, queen a1 check, king c4, and b5 check. And it turns out that white is losing the bishop too. In case the king moves to c5, queen c3 check would follow and the bishop would fall. And in case the king moves to b4, again after queen d4 check, the bishop would fall. For this reason, after b5 check, white resigned. And now I recommend watching a game that might help you understand the secret of Alekhine's magic. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.